60,000 bodies on a field that just yesterday was wheat. The smell of blood, mixed with the heat of the southern sun, hung over Cannae, and even centuries later historians would argue, how is it possible that the greatest army of the Republic perished in just one day? This question echoes through the ages, and it concerns not only the Romans, it concerns everyone who ever believed that numerical strength always guarantees victory. The answer lies in the determination of one man, Hannibal. But to understand how this catastrophe happened, we need to go back several years when Rome and Carthage were already waging their merciless war. The Roman Republic emerged victorious after the First Punic War, but Carthage, humiliated and devastated, was preparing revenge. Polybius wrote that Hannibal's hatred of Rome was absorbed with his mother's milk. His father, Hamilcar Barca, made his young son swear an oath of eternal enmity with Rome. This personal oath became the seed of the Second Punic War. At this time Rome, confident in its power, controlled a significant part of the Mediterranean, but underestimated Carthage's determination. Hannibal's enormous army traveled an incredible path, through the Pyrenees, through the Rhone, through the Alps, where even hardened warriors died from the cold. But it was this journey that created the legend. The Carthaginian army found itself on Italian soil, where no one expected its appearance. This crossing was so incredible that Livy described it as a miracle. Among the warriors who survived the crossing, the Romans saw monsters, not men, wounded, frostbitten, but with eyes burning with fury. The Carthaginian cavalry was the key to future victories. These horsemen were called Numidians, light cavalry from Africa, armed with spears and incredible speed. Their strikes resembled modern fighter attacks, sudden, swift, deadly. Unlike the heavily armed Roman cavalry, the Numidians didn't engage in prolonged combat, but circled, threw spears, and disappeared again. The Romans increasingly dragged themselves into a war they underestimated. The first major encounter, at Ticinus in 2818 BCE, already showed that Roman cavalry couldn't withstand the Carthaginian onslaught. Then came the Battle of Trasimene, where in the fog Hannibal destroyed an entire Roman army. Livy wrote that this was the greatest ambush in history, where Consul Flaminius perished. But Rome didn't surrender. The Republic raised new legions. At Cannae, according to various sources, nearly 80,000 Roman warriors and 45,000 Carthaginians met. Numerically, the Romans had an enormous advantage. Their confidence bordered on recklessness. The Senate demanded a decisive victory. Two consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, led the army, alternating command day by day. It's important here to remember the word legate. This is an assistant to the consul, a person who was responsible for separate parts of the army and had to execute orders without hesitation. In the Roman army, discipline was an absolute weapon. But in the Battle of Cannae, strict orders turned into shackles. They drove the legionaries into a deadly trap from which there was no escape. Imagination paints a picture. A dusty field, wind drives dry grasses, the sun scorches. The Romans line up in an enormous square, a dense mass like a stone wall. Their shields touch, the ranks extend into the depth. This colossus, confident in its unstoppability, moved forward. But the denser they went, the closer catastrophe came. And at this moment, when the Romans believed they were about to crush the enemy with numbers, Hannibal was already preparing his deadly trap that would change the very history of military art. The Roman army approached Cannae in the summer of 2016 BCE. This was the heart of Apulia, a rich grain region where enormous stores of wheat were kept. Control over this place meant control over supplies. But instead of waging an exhausting war of attrition, as some senators advised, Rome chose direct confrontation. The city crowd demanded a decisive battle. The Senate supported Varro, a proponent of immediate offensive, and didn't listen to the more cautious Aemilius Paulus. Thus, the fate of tens of thousands of legionaries was decided not by military calculations, but by political pressure. The army was the largest in the history of the Republic at that time. Contemporaries wrote that the number of warriors reached 80,000 infantrymen and about 6,000 horsemen, while Hannibal had about 45,000 soldiers and only 10,000 cavalry. At first glance, the outcome seemed obvious, but it was precisely the numbers that became Rome's weakness. Before the battle, it's important to understand what this man looked like. A legionary carried more than 30 kilograms of equipment, a shield nearly a meter high, a gladius sword, pilum throwing spears, armor and a supply of food. The Romans called themselves Marius's mules, accustomed to dragging everything necessary on their shoulders. In battle, this weight turned into protection, but on a hot day on an open field, this was a test of endurance. The Carthaginian army, in contrast, was diverse. Spaniards with long swords, Gauls with huge oval shields, African spearmen in armor, cavalry on both sides, heavy Spanish and light Numidian. This mixture of cultures and tactics made Hannibal's army flexible. As Polybius wrote, the Romans were like a wall of one material, and the Carthaginians like a mosaic where each part had its own strength. Among the Carthaginians, African spearmen played a special role. These were disciplined veterans, armed with long spears and rectangular shields. They can be compared to a modern professional guard, always ready for a decisive strike. It was them that Hannibal kept in reserve, like a knife in a sheath, to unsheath at the most terrible moment. The Romans took positions on the plain near the Ophidus River. Their battle formation was extraordinarily dense. Instead of traditional gaps between maniples, Varro ordered the ranks to close. Under normal conditions, maniples, small units of 120 men, acted cohesively and could maneuver, but here they were reduced to a solid mass. The term manipul itself meant handful, a small manageable part of the army. At Cannae, however, these handfuls turned into a monolith, deprived of flexibility. Hannibal positioned his forces differently. In the center, he placed the weaker Gauls and Spaniards, but formed them in a convex line, like an arc directed toward the enemy. African veterans stood on the edges, slightly drawn back. He divided the cavalry, heavy against the Roman cavalry on one flank, light Numidian on the other. This was a carefully thought-out trap in which every detail mattered. Historians note that Hannibal used psychology no worse than weapons. His warriors knew the enemy was larger, but they were instilled with the thought, in cramped conditions the Romans would lose strength. And when on the morning of August 2nd the sun rose over the plain, its rays struck directly into the legionaries' eyes, blinding and hitting their heavy armor. Polybius wrote that tension was already felt at the formation. The Roman army made noise, waved banners, trumpets sounded. The Carthaginians stood quieter, waiting. The contrast was striking. Some relied on mass and thunder, others on cold calculation. When the signal sounded, the Romans moved forward like an avalanche. Thousands of feet raised clouds of dust. This mass resembled an uncontrollable wave that sweeps away everything in its path. But it was at this moment that Hannibal's formation began to work. His center began to slowly retreat, bending inward. The Romans thought the enemy had faltered, and with even greater pressure rushed forward. They didn't know that the deeper they entered this arc, the closer came the moment when the edges would close behind their backs. African veterans awaited the order. Numidian cavalry circled, holding back Roman horsemen, not allowing them to interfere. Everything went according to plan, and it was precisely here, when the Romans felt the closeness of victory, that the ground beneath their feet turned into a deadly trap. Hannibal revealed his design, which would later be called the greatest military cunning of antiquity. The clash began with the thunder of hoofs. On the left flank, the heavy Carthaginian cavalry struck the Roman cavalry. These were Spaniards and Gauls in armor, armed with long swords and massive shields. The Romans couldn't withstand the onslaught. Their horsemen proved less numerous and less disciplined. The battle resembled a sports match where one team crushes the opponent with numbers and pressure. After a short time, the Roman cavalry turned to flight. Consul Aemilius Paulus tried to maintain order, but the Carthaginian pressure proved too strong. On the other flank, the Numidian cavalry played the game differently. Their fighting style was mobile and cunning. They didn't crash into the formation, but circled, threw spears, quickly retreated and returned again. This method can be compared to the tactics of modern special forces, which don't engage in open firefight, but exhaust the enemy with constant quick strikes. Roman horsemen in this section couldn't break through and were tied down in combat. In the center, the main event was happening. Thousands of Roman legionaries, closed in a dense mass, pressed on the Gauls and Spaniards. Those standing in the front ranks died one after another, but the line didn't break. It slowly rolled back like a drawn bowstring. Polybius noted that the Carthaginian center bent but didn't tear. At this moment, the Romans felt themselves almost victors. They shouted, "Press the enemy," increasingly driving him inward. And it was here that the very essence of the brilliant design worked. When the center finally curved inward in an arc, Hannibal gave the signal. African spearmen on the flanks moved forward. Their attack fell upon the Romans from both sides, like steel pincers. Now those who just a second ago felt superiority found themselves trapped. These spearmen were trained to fight in tight formation. Their spears pierced even through shields, and long blades finished the job. Their role can be compared to modern shock units, which are brought into battle only at the decisive moment. The word phalanx itself meant a dense spear formation. This was exactly how the African warriors advanced, closing around the Romans. Meanwhile, the cavalry, having routed the Romans' left flank, circled the battlefield and struck from behind. Varro, positioned with another part of the forces, tried to maintain general order, but at this moment the formation finally collapsed. The Roman army was surrounded on all sides. Polybius wrote, "There was no longer a front or rear. Death advanced from everywhere." The encirclement received the name double envelopment, or in Latin circumvallatio duplex. This tactic became a classic example of military art. The moment when an enormous mass of soldiers realizes there is no more escape can be compared to a crowd in a burning building when the doors are suddenly locked. The Romans continued to resist. The legions stood shoulder to shoulder, but each new step backward rested against the backs of comrades. Their swords couldn't work freely. Around was a solid wall of bodies. Instead of orderly combat, slaughter began. Cramped conditions, heat, thirst, all this made the situation unbearable. People fell not from wounds, but from suffocation in the crush. Roman centurions played an important role in these minutes. A centurion was a commander of approximately 100 men, distinguished by a helmet with a transverse crest. Their duty consisted of holding the formation at any cost, but on the field of Cannae, their efforts were powerless. They tried to shout, raise shields, maintain order, but when the army itself turned into a compressed lump, command lost meaning. Tacitus later wrote that no battlefield was so drenched in blood as at Cannae. People died not only from weapons, but also under the weight of their own comrades. The sun mercilessly scorched, the air filled with stench. The picture resembled a nightmare in which even warriors accustomed to blood lost their minds. And yet the battle continued. The Romans fought furiously, understanding there was no escape. Each step forward was met with a wall of African spears, each step backward with the backs of their own. Polybius described that the battle continued from morning until evening itself, and only by sunset did resistance finally break. But it was precisely in these hours that the Republic's fate was decided. Hundreds of banners were thrown in the dust, tens of thousands of bodies covered the plain. Hannibal achieved what was considered impossible. A smaller army destroyed a larger one. And yet this was not the end, but only a turning point. Because Rome, having lost 60,000 men in one day, still wasn't going to surrender. Sunset over Cannae painted the sky crimson, as if nature itself repeated the picture of the battlefield. When the sun's rays touched the dead bodies, the plain turned into an enormous cemetery. Livy wrote that until nightfall itself, the cries of the wounded and the neighing of horses were heard. The Roman army, once proud and invincible, ceased to exist in one day. The figures that ancient authors provide are staggering. Polybius spoke of more than 60,000 killed Romans. Livy indicated a slightly smaller figure, but even in the most cautious calculations, we're talking about tens of thousands of dead. Thousands were taken prisoner. For comparison, this is more than the population of many ancient cities. By modern standards, this is equivalent to the disappearance of an entire army in a few hours. Among the fallen were many senators and noble people. The Roman elite found itself in the ranks of the legions, and together with ordinary warriors, fell representatives of the most respected families. Consul Aemilius Paulus fell on the battlefield, fighting to the end. Varro managed to escape, but his name forever remained synonymous with defeat. The bodies lay so densely that, according to descriptions, one could walk on them without touching the ground. This was compared to a carpet of the dead. Those who still breathe suffocated under the mass of bodies, and cries drowned out the noise of night. Here it's important to remember the term tribune. This was a military official, a kind of officer responsible for a maniple or part of a legion. Many tribunes died together with their men, because their duty was to stand in the front ranks. The Carthaginians, despite the victory, also lost many, about 6,000 warriors. But against the backdrop of Roman losses, these figures seemed a drop in the ocean. Hannibal, according to ancient authors, on that day showed the greatest example of strategic art. His tactic of double envelopment forever entered textbooks. Even 2,000 years later, military academies of the world would analyze Cannae as a model of how smaller forces can destroy a larger army. But not only military science found a lesson here. This battle changed Rome's psychology. Never before had the Republic suffered such a blow. The city filled with mourning. By law, women could wear black for only 30 days, but after Cannae the restrictions were lifted because there were too many mourners. Every family lost someone. Archaeological findings confirm the scale of the tragedy. In Apulia, mass burials were discovered where bodies are stacked in layers, without honors, which corresponds to the descriptions of ancient authors. These bones are mute witnesses of the catastrophe. They are still being found, and each time they remind that the Battle of Cannae was not just a battle, but a real catastrophe for an entire civilization. Hannibal, after the victory, stood before a choice. His commanders advised marching on Rome and finishing the war, but he refused. The reasons are still discussed by historians. Some believe he lacked forces for a siege of the capital, others that he hoped to provoke betrayal of Rome's allies and destroy the Republic from within. This moment became a turning point. Livy wrote that one of the Carthaginian commanders, Hannibal, told Hannibal, "You know how to win, but you don't know how to use victory." But even without a march on Rome, the consequences were horrifying. Of 70,000 warriors, fewer than 10,000 returned home. The losses were so great that the Republic declared national mobilization. They began recruiting even teenagers and slaves into the army, just to fill the void. The word prefect itself acquired special meaning in those years. Prefects of camps and supplies now were responsible for gathering new troops and supplying them with weapons. They had to do the impossible. In a short time, create an army from people who had never held weapons. The psychological effect of Cannae is hard to overestimate. Allied cities of Italy began to waver. Part of them switched to Carthage's side. The whole world saw that Rome was not invincible. But it's precisely here that a paradox is born. The more terrible the blow was, the stronger Rome became after it. The Republic turned grief into determination, and defeat into a school of survival. Nevertheless, the picture of the battlefield would haunt the imagination for a long time. Thousands of bodies scattered across the plain, cries of the dying, blood soaking the earth. This scene, the embodiment of the horror of war, but behind it stood a great mystery. Why did Hannibal, having won so brilliantly, never break Rome definitively? After Cannae, a silence descended on Rome, resembling numbness. Defeats had happened before, but never had the Republic lost so many people in one day. Ancient authors wrote that mourning gripped the entire city. On the streets, songs didn't sound, children didn't play. Senators gathered in silence, understanding that the fate of the state hung by a thread. Polybius noted that in Rome almost no families remained untouched by this tragedy. And yet, it was precisely here that the unique strength of the Roman system manifested itself. When in other countries after such defeats armies fell apart and allies left, the Romans, on the contrary, began gathering new forces. Censuses were conducted, and even 14-year-old teenagers were called to the banners. Former slaves went into the army. They were promised freedom for service. This step was unheard of, but the Republic understood: either mobilization or death. Special attention was paid to discipline. Each new legion was built according to the old rules, and although among the soldiers were inexperienced people, the order remained unchanged. In this centurions helped, old warriors who had survived Cannae or previous battles. Their task consisted of holding the formation and training recruits. A centurion, distinguished by a transverse crest on his helmet, was not just an officer, he was the embodiment of tradition. Meanwhile, Hannibal celebrated victory, but his strategic goal, the destruction of Rome, was never achieved. Part of the Italian allies switched to his side. Capua, the second most important city of Italy, opened its gates to him. This was a serious blow to Rome's prestige. Other cities wavered, and it seemed the Republic was about to collapse. But here an amazing trait of the Romans manifested itself: resilience in the face of catastrophe. The Senate took measures to prevent panic. A cult of deities patronizing resilience and victory was introduced. The people were involved in religious rituals, reminding that Rome's fate depended on every citizen. This was not only a military, but also a psychological campaign. Archaeological data confirms that at this time the military economy intensified. In excavations they find weapons of cruder workmanship. This speaks of hasty production. Forges worked day and night, manufacturing swords and spears for new legions. Each iron product became an investment in the Republic's survival. The question of logistics is also interesting. After Cannae, Rome faced a shortage of provisions for the new army. According to descriptions, a legionary's ration included wheat from which bread was baked and meat, issued rarely. After the catastrophe, the share of bread in the ration increased and meat almost disappeared. There simply wasn't enough of it. This resembles a situation in a modern crisis, when products are distributed strictly by norm. Hannibal meanwhile moved across Italy, hoping that Rome would fall on its own under the weight of internal problems. He concluded alliances, intimidated, plundered, but his army gradually weakened. Carthage didn't send reinforcements, and each fallen warrior became an irreplaceable loss. The Romans drew conclusions. Ahead appeared a figure who would change the course of the war: Publius Cornelius Scipio. At that time he was still a young officer, miraculously saved at Cannae. According to Livy, he swore to avenge the defeat and devoted himself to war until the end. Later it was precisely he who would become Scipio Africanus and deliver Carthage a decisive blow. But then, after Cannae, all this was only in the future. The present represented a picture of grief and despair. In the city, public funerals were forbidden, because every day thousands died, and Rome could drown in grief. Instead, bodies were buried en masse or simply weren't managed to be committed to earth. An important element of restoration became camp prefects. They were responsible for organizing new recruits, their training and supply. These officials were like modern crisis staff managers. On them lay the entire burden of restoring the army. Their work rarely entered chronicles, but without them, the Republic couldn't have risen after such a blow. The most amazing thing in this story is that, despite the catastrophe, Rome refused negotiations. Many cities in their place would have concluded peace, but the Senate swore to continue war until victory. This spirit of persistence would become the foundation of Roman legend. And yet, the memory of Cannae remained alive. Each new warrior entering a legion knew that tens of thousands of his predecessors had fallen in one day. This memory wasn't abstract. Families preserved stories about the fallen. Wives wore mourning. Children grew up with the thought that they must take revenge. Thus the defeat that should have broken the Republic turned into its new strength. But why precisely Rome, having lost everything, was able to rise while many other peoples disappeared after smaller blows? The answer to this question lies in the finale of the war and in the fate of Hannibal himself. Several years passed after Cannae, and the war didn't end. Hannibal remained in Italy, but his army gradually lost strength. Carthage didn't send reinforcements. The Senate of Carthage didn't realize the scale of victory and didn't support its genius. Livy wrote that if at that moment Hannibal had received help, Rome could have fallen. But fate decided otherwise. Carthaginian warriors slowly thinned in battles and campaigns, and the Romans, on the contrary, revived from ashes. Rome found a new strategy. Unlike Varro, the Senate no longer strived for a decisive battle. Instead, the Romans switched to attrition tactics, avoided large battles, attacked Hannibal's detachments, deprived him of food and allies. This method entered history as Fabian strategy, named after dictator Fabius Maximus, nicknamed Cunctator, meaning the delayer. His approach was compared to a shadow that doesn't attack directly, but constantly follows the enemy, exhausting him. In these years, a new generation of warriors grew up. They remembered Cannae as a symbol of pain and a lesson of perseverance. Among them stood out Publius Cornelius Scipio. The young officer, saved from encirclement, became a popular hero. his determination and talent were noticed. Gradually, he rose to army command and put forward a bold idea: to transfer the war to Africa, to force Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. When Scipio landed in Africa, events took a new turn. He concluded an alliance with the Numidians, former allies of Hannibal. Their cavalry, which once crushed the Romans at Cannae, now became Rome's weapon. This was a blow to the heart of Carthaginian strategy. The word desertion itself acquired special meaning. Numidia's transition to Rome's side became a decisive turning point. In 2002 BCE, Hannibal, summoned to defend Carthage, met Scipio in the Battle of Zama. This encounter became a kind of mirror of Cannae. Now the Romans had the advantage in cavalry, and Scipio applied tactical tricks to neutralize the Carthaginian elephants. As a result, Hannibal suffered defeat and Carthage was forced to ask for peace. But even then, the shadow of Cannae didn't disappear. The Romans always remembered this day as the most terrible catastrophe and simultaneously as a lesson. Polybius claimed that it was precisely the ability to rise after Cannae that made Rome a great power. The loss of 60,000 warriors didn't destroy the Republic, but tempered it. In modern military art, the term Cannae maneuver is still used to designate complete encirclement of an enemy army. This tactic was applied in the 20th century as well, for example, in the largest operations of world wars. Thus, Hannibal's design has lived for more than 2,000 years and is studied in academies of all countries. Archaeologists continue to find confirmations of those events. In Apulia, spearheads, weapon fragments, and mass burials have been discovered. These findings make Cannae not an abstract history, but a visible reality. Each bone found in the earth reminds: here, on this field, occurred a tragedy almost unequaled in antiquity. For Rome, the consequences were colossal. After Cannae, the Republic restructured the system of military training, strengthened control over allies, and began creating the foundation for the future empire. One can say that it was precisely this defeat that became the foundation for future victories. But the main question remains, laid down at the beginning: how is it possible that an army having lost 60,000 men in one day not only survived, but won the war? The answer is that Rome's strength was not in numbers, but in its society. Every citizen felt himself part of a common cause. When legions fell, the Republic raised new ones. When allies wavered, the Senate reminded them of their oath. When death hung over the city, the Romans refused to surrender. And now, centuries later, this story addresses each of us personally. If Rome could rise after Cannae, then what can an ordinary person do, finding himself face to face with his own catastrophe? What is each of us capable of if fate demands the impossible? This question, like the echo of cries from the plain of Cannae, remains without a final answer. But it is precisely this that makes history alive and forces us again and again to return to that day when one army perished entirely and another changed the course of history.